So I can start my presentation. It is an overview of the folklore movement that arose in Soviet Lithuania in the 60s. It was the time when many people took interest in local history, ethnography, preservation of traditional culture, and the like. All that was taking place at the time when official ideology urged to forget the old times and fully focus on the present, on the building of the new society. So why the people who had left villages joined the folklore movement so willingly? The 50s was a decade when the considerable migration of the population was taking place in Soviet Lithuania. And when large number of villagers moved to the surrounding towns and to the capital Vilnius, change of residence and the attempt to adapt to the new environment was probably the most prominent experience of the post-war generation. In the post-war decades, Vilnius was brimming with new arrivals. They were usually referred to as the first generation from the blue, as they abandoned their parents' homesteads and left for the cities in search of a different life. Adaptation to the city life was not easy. The new arrivals' inner life and the system of their values were changing, and their social life and even the manner of their speaking were to change noticeable as well. Young people from villages realized that the homesteads they had left were crumbling down, and energy of their parents in those homesteads was wasting away. They felt guilt for the decline of traditional village culture and therefore wanted to accomplish something important, to save what was dear to them and to preserve village culture as a universe. Therefore, they would go to an expeditions and try to record as much of ethnographic material as they could. In the 60s, there arose a need to revive the movement of regional studies that had been disrupted by the Second World War. The first comprehensive expeditions of the Ethnographic Society was organized in 1963 and headed by folklorist Norbertas Vėlius. A largish group of students of different professions would arrive in the selected location, determined to examine its natural surroundings, the daily life, historical memory, the dialect, and the like. Norbertas Vėlius, the organizer of comprehensive expeditions, was a true leader of the ethnocultural movement, its spiritus movens. And we can see the movement of regional studies arose from the internal need of its participants to return to the village environment. However, this internal need underwent a transformation. It turned into an educational, explorative, and artistic activity. As sociologist Aine Ramonaitė maintains, people that took interest in ethnic culture spent evenings singing and dancing together and went to expeditions, formed a society with its own values, which did not believe the imposed ideology and did not accept the prevailing system. In 1968, folklore groups started appearing in Vilnius. Such gatherings of singing people were a transformation of the rural singing tradition. The very first folklore group started rehearsing in Vilnius University. Although folklore groups continued to some extent the traditions of village communities, the folklore movement that spread in the city had to inevitably manifest itself in the forms characteristic of urban culture. According to Aušra Zabelienė, whose research is focused on the folklore groups, rural communities usually sang the songs of their areas, while urban singers learn songs from different regions. The migrants that settle in the larger cities don't live in that area, rather they represent it. When they move to a large city, the regional identity that they had built in their young years is no longer enough. By participating in folklore groups, they start creating the common Lithuanian identity. The movement would not have gained impetus without its prominent personalities who generated ideas. If we produced a timeline and marked the books and folklore collections published in the 60s and in the 70s by Lithuanian folklorists, we would see that they were not following the rising folklore movement, but leading it, with their works laying the foundations of the movement. As for the 60s, mention should be made of the 5 volumes of Lietuvių tautosaka, Lithuanian Folklore. The 60s saw the appearance of Jadvygas Čiurlionytė books, Melodic Properties of Lithuanian Folk Songs, and Donatas Saukas study, Originality and Value of Folklore. Their authors were not only scholars, but also professors who gave interesting and memorable lectures. They opened the depths of traditional culture to many students. Not only folklorists of Vilnius University, but also researchers of the Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Language played an important role. It's obvious that folklorists were not the observers of the movement who regarded it as a field of their research and collected data for their academic works. They were the initiators of this movement. In the second half of the 20th century, Lithuanian archaic polyphonic songs were under serious threat. It first through the joint efforts of the folklorists and the participants of the folklore movement that the tradition of their singing was preserved. How did then Suthertanias survive? Research shows that during the post-war years, the traditional manner of handing down the Suthertanias was replaced by the post-traditional way. In other words, the oral way was replaced by the written way. There emerged a new community of Suthertanias singers, researchers, and preservers, which succeeded in saving these songs. Quite powerful wave of folklorism swept over the independent Republic of Lithuania between the wars, especially in the 30s. Unfortunately, this early rise of folklorism was stopped when Lithuania was occupied. Almost each Lithuanian family suffered losses in their next of kin, their property, spiritual strength, and peace of mind during the Second World War. During the deportations carried out during the war and in the post-war years, some singers of Suthertanias were forcefully removed from their homes. The family of Suthertanias singer and village teacher Emilija Zaukaitė Kuzavinienė was not an exception. Emilia was deported to Siberia, Altai region with her husband and children. Her daughter, Edita Kuzavinytė Meškotienė, learned to sing Suthertanias from her mother in exile. So how did Suthertania survive? The tradition was continued even in such conditions. In the middle of the 20th century, Suthertines lost contact with the places of their origin. The number of Suthertines singers shrank dramatically, and there were only few families in which ancient polyphonic singing was handed down from generation to generation. Fortunately, the traditional transfer of knowledge was replaced by post-traditional one. Such an opportunity arose when the publication of important collection of Suthertines prepared by Zenonas Laviūnas was published. Suthertines recorded by compiler and earlier folklore collectors were published in 3 volumes of this work. After the appearance of these volumes, one could hope that Suthertines tradition would gradually start climbing up. The new protectors of Suthertines came from different places of Lithuania and had hardly heard a single Suthertines sung by the members of their families. They learned about ancient polyphony in lectures and libraries and accepted it as a cultural value that belonged to all members of the academic community. According to the contemporaries, the revival of Suthertines tradition took place in the 1968 in Vilnius, when young professional performers, actors, and musicians gave a stage performance of a complete program of Suthertines. Later, this group was named Lithuanian Folklore Theatre. It was led by Povilas Motaitis. One can claim, therefore, that starting from 1968, a community of educated individuals took the responsibility for the preservation of Suthertines tradition. The first program of Suthertines was followed by other groups of Suthertines singers. They were joined by groups of skudučiai and horn players focused on reviving and continuing this tradition in the urban environment. In the late 20th century, the number of nurturers of traditional polyphony started rising, and the danger of the vanishing of Suthertines and instrumental polyphony was gone. And conclusions. The folklore movement that arose in Lithuania in the 60s took shape in the capital, and Vilnius University was one of its centers. It was stimulated by folklorist scholarly works, folklore recordings, and collections of folklore songs and tales. If we produced a timeline and marked the books of folklore collection published in the 60s and 70s by Lithuanian folklorists, we would see that they were not following the rising folklore wave, but leading the movement. An urban community for the preservation of Suthertines also evolved in Vilnius in the 60s. It saved the archaic polyphonic song Suthertines from extinction. Thanks to this community, the tradition of singing Suthertines was brought back to life. At present, these polyphonic songs are performed both in Vilnius, which became a center of their existence, and in smaller towns. The traditional transfer of singing Suthertines was replaced by post-traditional one. Thank you. It's the end of presentation.